Hey everyone, Zach here. Today I was going to walk through really quickly how you can use Ansible to connect to some target hosts behind a bastion or an SSH proxy. So this isn't super uncommon. At the end, I'll talk about if you're looking at more enterprise scale, you probably want to use automation mesh. But sometimes for smaller private networks, if you're just testing, this can be a very useful thing to be able to do. So my environment, super simple. I've got my execution node talking to a bastion host, which has some target guests sitting behind it in VMware in a private network. So from the Ansible perspective, I have to set some SSH common arguments, basically to tell Ansible when it's running the SSH command to connect to the target host to go through a proxy. So this is what the configuration looks like. You can read a little bit more about that in detail, but you'll notice I have some variables here. In order to inject these variables, I'm going to create a custom credential type. That custom credential will have an injector configuration that looks like this. You can read more about that as well, of course, in the links from the references where I'll point to the full custom credential type. But what it's going to do is basically you will set it up to give it a proxy host. I'm not going to use a password. I'm going to use a key. I don't recommend using a password. The proxy username, and then as well as a proxy key, which is going to inject a file, right, as opposed to just a private key string. And if I scroll down, I'll also be using a typical machine credential. So if you've used an Ansible controller or tower, this should not be anything new to you. And this is going to be for connecting to the target host itself versus just the bastion, which is what the custom credential is for. And we'll put it all together. So we'll create a job template that actually reaches out and connects to a host in a private network through a bastion. So let's hop over to the platform and talk about those different pieces. First thing I'll do is I'll go to my credential types, and I'm going to search for SSH Proxy because I've already created it. And you'll notice here I can expand the input configuration, basically just have these 4 inputs, and only username and host are required, so you can either use a password or a private key, and that injector config that we just talked about. So in my example, my actual credential that I created of this credential type, so let's see, is this VMware bastion. And you'll see I have my username of lab user. I've got my proxy host here, and then of course my private key is encrypted. The other credential I will have for this use case is going to be, like I mentioned, the regular machine credential. And for that one, it's going to be username Ansible, and again, the private key that is has the ability to connect via SSH to the target guest itself. So those will both be attached to the job template. And the last important piece is where are we going to set that SSH common args variable? In my case, I'm going to set it at the group level in an inventory. So I have this cloud inventory. I have a few groups. And then I have this group called new guest. And this is actually where I'm setting my configuration so that when I attach that proxy credential to a job template, it's going to populate the proxy key here and then the username and host. And it's going to tell Ansible, hey, go through the bastion host when you run any automation against host in this particular group. So let's go to the job template. And I've got this gather facts job template that I created just as a kind of basically a no op, but I am connecting to the host itself and gathering the facts. If I go to edit here, you'll see I've got my 2 credentials attached. I'm pointing at that cloud inventory I told you about. And if I scroll down here, I've got my limit defaulted to new guest. So in theory, if I had multiple guests there, I only have one for this example, but if I had multiple, it would actually go out and talk to the host, to the group, each host in the group, and use that as well. One other thing I want to show in the inventory is just that. If I go to the host, this is my Autodotes demo VM. You'll notice that it has a private IP address. So I actually have the Ansible host set to a private IP, which I would not be able to connect to without the bastion configuration. So let's go ahead and kick off a job. I tested it just a moment ago, but I'll go ahead and relaunch it just to show it kind of live in action. And you'll see here that it's kicked off. We scroll down. I've got connection debug on just because I think it's interesting to show the proxy command. So you'll notice here, if you look a little bit closely, where we actually see that configuration we set up. It's defining that proxy command to go through with my private key that was injected via my custom credential, and then my lab user and host name that was also injected via that custom credential. and then it was able to connect as Ansible to that private IP address here and gather facts. So I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to drop a note on the video or on the blog, and you'll be able to connect to your host, and then you can do any automation, right? So in this example, I was just gathering facts, but once you've set up that connection, all bets are off, and you're able to run your playbooks against those hosts. Thanks for listening.